Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving headfirst into a pivotal moment in history, a time when a brand new nation stood on the brink, fresh from a hard-won victory, but with no clear path forward. We're talking about Chapter 1, The World After Revolution. Grab a comfy seat because this is where America truly begins to define itself, in a period often overlooked but absolutely crucial. Picture this. It's 1783. The smoke has cleared. The cannons are silent. The British have officially signed the Treaty of Paris, recognizing the United States of America as a free and independent nation. Can you imagine the sheer exhilaration, the relief, the pride? 13 small, determined colonies, against all odds, had defeated the mightiest empire on earth. They had done it. They had fought for and won their independence. But once the parades ended and the celebratory toasts subsided, a profound question loomed large. What now? The reality was, victory was just the beginning of a whole new set of challenges. This wasn't some clear-cut transition. Far from it, the world the colonists had known for generations was gone, replaced by an uncharted landscape. For centuries, their lives had been structured, governed, and ultimately defined by the British Crown. There was a king, a parliament, established laws, and a clear hierarchy. Now, gone. All of it. The very foundation of their political existence had been dismantled. So, here they were, a collection of states, not a unified nation in the way we understand it today. Imagine being in their shoes. You've just overthrown a monarchy because you fiercely believed in self-governance and local control. The last thing you want is to replace one powerful, distant ruler with another. This deeply ingrained fear of centralized power was absolutely paramount in their thinking. It shaped everything that came next. The result? No king. That was a given. But also, no real national government in any meaningful sense. Think about that for a second. 13 sovereign states, each with its own interests, its own distinct culture, its own economy, and its own vision for the future. They were more like 13 independent countries, loosely bound together by the shared experience of the war and a very tentative agreement called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles, created even before the war ended, were designed to be incredibly weak on purpose. The states were terrified of creating a new tyranny, so they gave the central government almost no power. It was less of a government and more of a firm league of friendship. A nice idea, but practically, it was a recipe for chaos. The national government couldn't directly tax the states or their citizens. It couldn't regulate interstate commerce. It couldn't even enforce its own laws effectively. Imagine trying to run a country when your central authority has to asks for money from the states, and they can just say no. Imagine trying to make national policy when each state can essentially do its own thing. This lack of a strong central authority led to immense uncertainty and instability. The euphoria of independence quickly began to fade as the harsh realities of governing themselves set in. Economically, things were a mess. The war had left the states deeply in debt. Each state was printing its own currency, leading to massive inflation and making trade between them incredibly difficult. You could have Virginia money worth one thing, and Maryland money worth something entirely different, causing confusion and economic disruption. Farmers, many of whom had fought in the war, were struggling. They were losing their land due to debt and taxes, and there was no strong national government to intervene or help. Politically, the states were often at odds. Border disputes, trade disagreements, and competing interests were common. Without a strong arbiter, these disputes could escalate. Foreign nations, particularly Britain and Spain, looked on with a mixture of skepticism and opportunity. They doubted this American experiment would last. Why would they take a fragile, disunited collection of states seriously? The new nation lacked credibility on the world stage, making it vulnerable and isolated. The military, too, was in shambles. The Continental Army had largely disbanded after the war, and there was no national standing army to protect the borders or enforce domestic order. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, a revolt of indebted farmers, starkly highlighted just how powerless the national government was under the Articles. It could only even raise an army to put down an internal uprising without begging individual states for help. This event, more than almost any other, sent a shiver down the spines of many leaders, demonstrating the urgent need for a stronger, more unified government. So, in the aftermath of revolution, what the Americans faced was not a clear path to prosperity, but a treacherous tightrope walk. They had won their freedom, but now they had to figure out how to keep it, how to build a nation from the ground up, and how to create a government that was strong enough to function, but not so strong that it became tyrannical. It was a monumental challenge, a truly unprecedented experiment. This period, often called the critical period, was fraught with tension, debate, and profound questions about the very nature of liberty and government. It was here, in this crucible of uncertainty, that the seeds for a new, stronger form of government began to be sown. The experiences under the Articles of Confederation would directly inform and inspire the creation of the United States Constitution, a document born out of a deep understanding of what *Diadin, single quotes T, asterisk work. It is a testament to the vision and perseverance of these early American leaders that they didn't give up. They didn't retreat into 13 separate little countries. Instead, they recognized the existential threat posed by their disunity and eventually came together to forge a more perfect union. Their journey from triumph to turmoil, and then to a new form of governance, is one of the most compelling stories in history, and it's just getting started. What do you think was the biggest challenge facing the states right after the revolution? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into early American history, please hit that like button. Share this video with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving headfirst into a super important, but often overlooked, part of American history, Chapter 2, all about the Articles of Confederation. Now, before the United States became the nation we know today, with its constitution and strong federal government, it had to try out a few ideas first, and its very first attempt at a national government. That was the Articles of Confederation. Imagine this. After fighting a long, hard war for independence against a powerful king and a strong central government, the newly freed American colonies were, understandably, a little wary of putting too much power in one place again. They'd just escaped tyranny, right? So, when it came time to figure out how to govern themselves, their priority was ensuring the states retained most of the power. They wanted to prevent another King George III situation at all costs. This cautious approach led to the creation of the Articles of Confederation, which officially came into effect in 1781. Think of it less like a strong national government, and more like a loose friendship pact among the independent countries, because that's essentially how the states saw themselves back then. Each state was fiercely sovereign and independent, and they wanted to keep it that way. The Articles were designed to create a league of friendship between the states, rather than a unified nation. So, what did this mean in practice? Well, the Articles established a very weak central government. It was basically just a Congress, and even that Congress had extremely limited powers. It could declare war, make treaties, and coin money, but its ability to actually do anything meaningful was severely hampered. This was a deliberate choice, driven by that deep-seated fear of centralized authority we just talked about. The states really called the shots. Let's break down some of the biggest problems that arose from this setup, because these weaknesses ultimately spelled the end for the Articles. One of the most glaring issues was that the federal government, under the Articles, had no power to tax. Think about that for a second. How do you run a country, pay for services, or even repay war debts if you can't collect money? The national government had to ask the states for money, and the states, more often than not, just said no. They had their own priorities and often didn't want to contribute. It was like trying to run a business where you and charge your customers. It just was unsustainable. This lack of taxing power led to a constant state of financial crisis for the new nation. They couldn't pay their soldiers who had just fought for independence. They couldn't pay off foreign loans, and they certainly couldn't fund any national projects or infrastructure. It created a situation where the national government was essentially begging for funds, which severely undermined its authority and effectiveness. Another massive weakness, the Articles of Confederation didn't allow for a national army. Now, they had just fought a war, and they needed to be able to defend themselves, right? But instead of a unified military, each state was responsible for its own militia. If there was a threat to the entire nation, the federal government had to request troops from the states. And, just like with money, states could choose whether or not to send them. This made the country incredibly vulnerable, both to internal unrest and external threats. Imagine trying to coordinate a defense when every state can decide for itself whether to participate. This became very real during events like Shays' Rebellion, where a group of farmers in many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, rebelled over economic hardship and heavy taxes imposed by their state government. The national government was virtually powerless to help. Massachusetts quelled the rebellion because it couldn't raise an army or funds. It was a stark reminder that a strong, unified defense was absolutely necessary. And finally, there was no central authority. What do I mean by that? Well, there was no president to lead the executive branch, and no national court system to interpret laws or resolve disputes between states. All judicial matters were handled at the state level, and the legislative branch, that one-house Congress, was largely ineffective, because it needed 9 out of 13 states to agree on most important decisions. Getting 9 states to agree on anything was almost impossible. It meant that passing laws, implementing policies, or even amending the articles themselves was an incredibly difficult and frustrating process. So, you had a national government that couldn't tax, couldn't raise an army, and couldn't effectively enforce laws or resolve conflicts. Each state basically acted like its own little country, often putting its own interests ahead of the collective good. This led to trade disputes between states, economic chaos, and a general sense of disunity and weakness on the international stage. Other countries looked at the fledgling United States and saw a collection of squabbling states rather than a unified nation. While the Articles of Confederation represented an important first step and reflected the era, a sphere of powerful central government, its fundamental weaknesses quickly became apparent. It was like trying to build a house without a strong foundation. It was destined to crumble. But here is the positive takeaway. Recognizing these critical flaws is what ultimately led to the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the United States Constitution, the document that has guided our nation for over 2 centuries. The Articles, despite their shortcomings, were a crucial learning experience that paved the way for a stronger, more effective government. They showed the young nation what didn't work and highlighted the absolute necessity of a more robust federal structure that could truly unite the states and ensure their common defense, general welfare, and economic stability. So, while we often focus on their failures, remember that the Articles of Confederation were an indispensable part of America's journey to becoming the nation it is today. And that wraps up our look at the Articles of Confederation. I hope this helped you understand why this early form of government was created and why it ultimately needed to be replaced. If you found this video helpful, please give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more history deep dives. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the birth of a nation. In our last chapter, we celebrated the hard-won victory of the American Revolution. The air was thick with the promise of liberty and a bright new future. But as the echoes of fireworks and cheers faded, a harsh reality began to set in. The dream, it turned out, was hanging by a thread. This is Chapter 3. A Fragile Union. Imagine you've just won the biggest game of your life. You and your teammates are champions. But the moment you get back to the locker room, everyone starts arguing. Who gets which trophy? Who's in charge now? That's exactly what was happening in America. The 13 states, once united against a common enemy, were now starting to look at each other as rivals. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing document, had created a league of friendship, but it was a friendship that was quickly souring. The central government was designed to be a weaker reaction against the powerful British monarchy. It was so weak it was nearly useless. It couldn't raise taxes, couldn't enforce laws, and couldn't stop the states from squabbling. One of the biggest problems was trade. Think of the states as 13 separate little countries, all trying to get ahead. New York started taxing goods coming in from Connecticut and New Jersey. New Jersey, in retaliation, charged New York a massive fee for a lighthouse it owned on Sandy Hook. It was like putting up toll booths on every state line. Farmers in Massachusetts couldn't sell their crops in neighboring Rhode Island without paying a hefty tariff. This economic warfare was choking the new nation. Instead of a free-flowing national economy, they'd created a tangled mess of protectionism and resentment. The very commerce that was supposed to make the nation prosperous was grinding to a halt. And then there were the soldiers. The men who had bled and sacrificed for years to win the war came home not to parades and pensions, but to empty promises. The Continental Congress had no money to pay them. Many soldiers had been given IOUs, essentially paper slips, promising future payment, but these slips were becoming worthless. Desperate for cash to feed their families and pay their debts, many veterans sold these notes to speculators for pennies on the dollar. Can you imagine the bitterness? They had risked everything for the idea of America, only to be left with nothing. This wasn't just an economic problem. It was a moral crisis. The nation was failing its heroes. In 1783, a group of angry officers in Newburgh, New York, were on the verge of a military coup, threatening to march on Congress if they weren't paid. It took a personal, emotional appeal from George Washington himself to stop them. He pulled out his glasses, admitting he had grown gray and nearly blind in the service of his country, and shamed them into standing down. The crisis was averted, but the underlying problem remained. The government was broke. This financial chaos rippled through every level of society. With no stable national currency, states printed their own money, but a dollar from Virginia wasn't worth the same as a dollar from Pennsylvania. In some states, like Rhode Island, the government printed massive amounts of paper money to help debtors, which caused rampant inflation. A loaf of bread that cost a shilling one day might cost 10 the next. Creditors were ruined, and the economy was in a tailspin. This economic instability created a deep sense of unease. People had fought for freedom, but what good was freedom if you couldn't afford to live? Farmers were losing their land to foreclosure because they couldn't pay their taxes. Taxes that were being demanded in hard currency, which they didn't have. This growing discontent finally boiled over in the summer of 1786 in western Massachusetts. A Revolutionary War captain named Daniel Chase led a rebellion of desperate farmers. They weren't lawless criminals. They were citizens who felt betrayed. They shut down courthouses to prevent judges from foreclosing on their farms. They took up arms against the very government they had helped create. Shays' Rebellion, as it came to be known, sent a shockwave across the entire country. The national government was powerless to stop it. It fell to Massachusetts to raise a private army to put down the uprising. This was the tipping point. It was now terrifyingly clear to leaders like Washington, Madison, and Hamilton that the Articles of Confederation were a complete failure. The League of Friendship had devolved into chaos and conflict. The dream of a free and prosperous republic was on the verge of becoming a nightmare. The liberty they had fought so hard for was at risk of being lost, not to a foreign king, but to their own disunity and weakness. Something had to be done, and fast, or the United States of America would collapse before it ever truly began. The crisis had reached a breaking point. It was a time of immense peril, but also of immense opportunity. The nation's leaders now faced a choice: watch their creation fall apart, or dare to do something radical, something unprecedented, to save it. And that decision would lead them down a path to Philadelphia, to a meeting that would change the course of history forever. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. The story is just getting started, and the next chapter is one of the most important in American history. If you're finding this series valuable, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next chapter. Start with a dramatic, attention-grabbing opening. Imagine this. You've just fought for your country's freedom. You've faced down the most powerful empire on earth, and, against all odds, you've won. You return to your farm, a hero, ready to build a new life in a new nation. But instead of a hero's welcome, you find crushing debt, soaring taxes, and the threat of losing everything you own. What would you do? This isn't a hypothetical question. This was the reality for thousands of American farmers in the 1780s, and it set the stage for one of the most pivotal, yet often overlooked, chapters in American history. Shays' Rebellion. Transition to the main narrative. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the founding of America. Today, we're diving into a story of desperation, conflict, and the near collapse of a fledgling nation. To understand Shays' rebellion, we first need to meet its reluctant leader, Daniel Shays. Shays wasn't a radical revolutionary foaming at the mouth. He was an ordinary man, a farmer from western Massachusetts, who had served with distinction in the Continental Army. He was even presented with a ceremonial sword by the Marquis de Lafayette for his service, but when he came home, the promises of a bright future felt like a lie. The America of the 1780s was governed by a document called the Articles of Confederation. Think of it as America's first attempt at a constitution. And to be blunt, it was a mess. It created a weak central government that couldn't effectively collect taxes, regulate trade, or even pay its own soldiers. Each of the 13 states was essentially its own little country, printing its own money and setting its own rules. This created economic chaos. In Massachusetts, the wealthy merchant class in Boston controlled the state government. To pay off war debts, they imposed heavy land taxes. This hit Western farmers like Daniel Shays. These farmers were cash. They bartered goods and had little hard currency. Yet the state demanded taxes be paid in gold or silver, money they simply didn't have. So what happened when they couldn't pay? The courts stepped in. Farms were seized. Property was auctioned off. Men who had fought for liberty were being thrown into debtor's prison. It felt like a betrayal. They had replaced a distant king with a new form of tyranny right in their own backyard. The farmers tried to protest peacefully. They sent petitions to the legislature in Boston, pleading for relief. They asked for the government to print more paper money or allow them to pay taxes with farm goods. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. The Boston elite saw them as lazy and irresponsible. By the summer of 1786, patience had run out. All across western Massachusetts, farmers began to take matters into their own hands. They organized, they armed themselves, and they marched on the county courthouses. Their goal was simple. If the courts couldn't sit, they couldn't foreclose on their farms. Leading one of these groups was Captain Daniel Shays. These protesters, who called themselves regulators, saw themselves as patriots, acting in the same spirit as the Sons of Liberty who had dumped tea into Boston Harbor just a decade earlier. They were fighting against unjust taxation and a government that wasn't representing them, but the state government saw it differently. To them, this was an open insurrection. Governor James Bowdoin was determined to crush the rebellion. The problem was, the national government under the Articles of Confederation was powerless to help. It had no army and no money to raise one. So, the Boston merchants took matters into their own hands. They privately funded their own militia, led by former Continental Army General Benjamin Lincoln. Now, you had two groups of veterans, men who had fought side by side in the Revolution, preparing to face each other on the battlefield. It was a tragedy in the making. The climax came in January of 1787. Shays and his regulators, desperate for weapons and supplies, decided to seize the federal arsenal at Springfield. Their plan was to capture the weapons and march on Boston. They believed if they could just show their strength, the government would finally listen. But their plan was flawed. They split their forces, and a crucial message coordinating the attack was intercepted. When Shays and his 1,500 men approached the arsenal on a frigid January afternoon, they found General Lincoln's militia waiting for them. The state militia fired a warning shot over the heads of the rebels. They didn't disperse. Then, the cannons fired grapeshot directly into their ranks. The farmers, armed mostly with muskets and pitchforks, were no match for artillery. The rebellion was shattered in an instant. 4 men were killed, and the rest fled in a panic. The fighting was over. In the aftermath, the state cracked down hard. Hundreds of regulators were arrested. Several were sentenced to death, though most were later pardoned. Daniel Shays himself escaped to Vermont, living in hiding, branded a traitor. So, if the rebellion was crushed so easily, why do we call it a wake-up call? Because news of the uprising spread like wildfire, and it horrified the nation's leaders. George Washington, living in retirement at Mount Vernon, was deeply disturbed. He wrote, "I am mortified beyond expression. Are we to have the goodly fabric that we have been 7 years raising pulled over our heads?" He feared the country was sliding into anarchy. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others, realized the Articles of Confederation were not just weak, they were dangerous. A government that couldn't maintain order, protect property, or address the grievances of its own citizens was a failure. Shays' rebellion exposed the fundamental flaws of the system. It proved, in dramatic fashion, that the United States needed a stronger, more effective national government. The fear of another, larger rebellion spurred them into action. It was the final push needed to convene a special meeting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Their original goal was just to revise the Articles of Confederation, but thanks to the shock wave sent by Daniel Shays and his band of farmers, the delegates quickly decided to scrap the Articles entirely and start from scratch. That convention, of course, would become the Constitutional Convention. They would go on to draft the United States Constitution, the very framework of government we live under today. It created a federal government with the power to tax, to raise an army, to regulate commerce, and to ensure, as the preamble states, domestic tranquility. In a profound and ironic twist of fate, the failed rebellion of a desperate farmer from Massachusetts was the catalyst that led directly to the creation of a more perfect union. Daniel Shays lost his battle, but in doing so, he helped save the Republic. He was eventually pardoned and lived out the rest of his life, quietly. A forgotten footnote for many, but a man whose actions had earth-shattering consequences. Shays' rebellion is a powerful reminder that history is often messy, and that progress can be born from conflict and failure. It shows that our nation's founding wasn't a straight, clean line, but a series of struggles, arguments, and near. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a crucial moment in American history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters from our nation's past. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll be heading to that fateful convention in Philadelphia. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the making of America. In our last episode, we explored the chaos and confusion that gripped the young nation under the Articles of Confederation. Shays' rebellion had just sent shockwaves through the states, proving that the central government was simply too weak to maintain order. It was a wake-up call, a blaring alarm that something had to change, and fast. From this turmoil, a new generation of leaders began to emerge, not with despair, but with a bold and audacious plan. Two men, in particular, stepped into the spotlight: the brilliant and ambitious Alexander Hamilton from New York, and the scholarly, meticulous James Madison from Virginia. These were men who had seen the revolution firsthand. They understood the sacrifices made for liberty, but they also recognized that liberty without order was a recipe for disaster. They weren't alone. Figures like John Jay and even a reluctant George Washington, who had retired to Mount Vernon hoping for a quiet life, started to correspond, sharing their growing anxieties. They saw a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The economy was a mess. States were bickering like rival kingdoms, and foreign powers were circling, waiting for the American experiment to fail. Hamilton, ever the man of action, had been advocating for a stronger national government for years. He saw the potential for a commercial and industrial powerhouse, but knew it could never be realized with 13 separate states pulling in 13 different directions. He wrote powerfully, arguing that the nation needed a government with real authority, the power to tax, to regulate trade, and to command respect on the world stage. Madison, on the other hand, was the quiet, intellectual force. He spent months, even years, buried in books, studying the histories of republics and confederacies from ancient Greece to modern Europe. He meticulously documented their failures, trying to understand why so many had crumbled from within. His conclusion was clear. A simple league of friendship, like the one created by the Articles, was doomed. What was needed was a completely new framework, a government that derived its power from the people, not just the states. Together, these forward-thinking leaders started a movement. They began to plant the idea of a grand meeting, a national convention. The purpose they initially proposed was modest: to revise the Articles of Confederation. This was a clever political strategy. Calling for a complete overhaul right away might have scared off the more cautious states. Revision sounded much less threatening, more like a tune-up, than a total replacement. Their first attempt was the Annapolis Convention in 1786. It was, well, a bit of a flop. Only 5 states sent delegates. It seemed like the idea was dead on arrival, but Hamilton and Madison were not easily discouraged. They seized the opportunity. With the few delegates who did show up, they drafted a bold report. Pointing to the nation's mounting problems, they called for another convention, a bigger one, to be held the following year in Philadelphia. This time, they urged all 13 states to participate. The proposal was sent to the Confederation Congress. And what did Congress do? It hesitated. Many members were deeply suspicious of any attempt to centralize power. They feared that a stronger national government would trample on the rights of the states, creating the very tyranny they had just fought a war to escape. The debate was fierce. Some argued it was an illegal, even revolutionary, act to go beyond the scope of the Articles. But then, the news of Shays' rebellion, which we discussed last time, spread like wildfire. The image of farmers taking up arms against their own government terrified the wealthy and powerful. It was the final push. The crisis made it impossible to ignore the pleas of Hamilton and Madison. The fear of anarchy finally outweighed the fear of a stronger government. The pressure became immense. One by one, states began to agree to send delegates. Even the most reluctant politicians had to admit that the status quo was unsustainable. The Confederation Congress, seeing the tide turn, finally gave its reluctant blessing. It officially called for a convention in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And so, the stage was set. In May of 1787, delegates from across the nation would begin to gather in the same city, in the very same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed just 11 years earlier. They were coming to revise a document, but many of them, including Madison and Hamilton, had a much grander vision. They were not coming to patch up an old, leaky ship. They were coming to build a new one entirely. They were an extraordinary group of men. Benjamin Franklin, the wise old sage of the Revolution, would be there. George Washington would be coaxed out of retirement to preside over the convention, lending his immense prestige to the proceedings. And of course, Hamilton and Madison would be there, armed with their research, their arguments, and their unwavering belief in a stronger American Union. Little did they know that this meeting, born from a sense of crisis and desperation, would become one of the most pivotal moments in human history. Over a long, hot summer, behind closed doors, and sworn to secrecy, they would hammer out a document that would change the world. The United States Constitution. The call had been made, and the nation's best and brightest had answered. The journey was far from over, and the debates would be long and arduous. But the first crucial step had been taken. The Philadelphia Convention was no longer just an idea. It was a reality. Thank you so much for watching. Join us next time as we open the doors to Independence Hall and witness the beginning of the Constitutional Convention. If you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of our story. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we step into the sweltering summer of 1787, into the very room where a nation would be redefined. This is Philadelphia, and something monumental is about to happen. Imagine the scene. It's late May. In Philadelphia, the air is thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your clothes and makes every breath feel heavy. But inside a stately brick building, the Pennsylvania State House, soon to be known forever as Independence Hall, an even greater tension is building. This is the gathering place, the crucible where the future of the United States will be forged. Delegates are arriving from across the fledgling nation. They come by horseback and by carriage, traveling for days, even weeks, over rough, dusty roads. These aren't just any men. They are the luminaries of their time. Governors, lawyers, planters, merchants, each a leader in his own right, each carrying the hopes and fears of his home state. They are converging on Philadelphia not for a simple meeting, but for a task of immense, almost unimaginable gravity. The original purpose, as stated publicly, was modest enough: to revise the Articles of Confederation. The Articles, America's first attempt at a national government, were failing spectacularly. The central government was powerless, unable to levy taxes, regulate trade, or even enforce its own laws. The nation was adrift, facing economic chaos, internal rebellions like Shays' Rebellion in Madison, and a distinct lack of respect from foreign powers. The United States were anything but. The dream of the revolution was in peril, at risk of dissolving into 13 squabbling, independent territories. So, the call went out. Let's meet. Let's talk. Let's patch up the holes in our system. But as the delegates gathered, a bolder, more radical idea began to circulate in hushed tones. Whispers of not just amending the articles, but scrapping them entirely, of creating something new, something stronger, something that had never been tried before. A true national republic on a continental scale. This was a secret, a dangerous ambition that, if successful, would amount to a second, peaceful revolution. Think about the atmosphere. Secrecy was paramount. To allow for open and honest debate, free from public pressure and sensationalist news reports, the delegates agreed to conduct their proceedings behind closed doors. The windows of Independence Hall were nailed shut, despite the oppressive summer heat. Guards were posted at the doors. Every delegate swore an oath of secrecy, promising not to breathe a word of their discussions to anyone outside the room. What happened in that hall was to stay in that hall. This veil of secrecy only added to the weight of their purpose. They were operating in a self-imposed bubble, wrestling with the fate of millions, present and future. Now, let's look at who was arriving. 12 of the 13 states sent delegations. From Virginia came a towering, quiet figure, a man who commanded universal respect without needing to say much at all. George Washington. His very presence lent an unparalleled legitimacy to the proceedings. He was reluctant to return to public life, but he knew the stakes. Alongside him was the scholarly James Madison, small in stature but a giant in intellect. Madison had spent months, even years, studying governments ancient and modern, preparing for this moment. He arrived with a plan in his pocket, a blueprint for a new government that would become the foundation of the debate. From Pennsylvania, the host state, came the venerable Benjamin Franklin. At 81 years old, he was the elder statesman. His health was failing, and he often had to be carried into the hall in a sedan chair. Yet, his mind remained sharp, his wit legendary, and his wisdom a crucial balm for the heated debates to come. Also from Pennsylvania was the brilliant but often overlooked James Wilson, a legal scholar whose ideas on national sovereignty would be profoundly influential, and Gouverneur Maurice, the penman of the Constitution, who would later be responsible for the eloquent final wording of the document. Alexander Hamilton arrived from New York, a young, ambitious, and tireless advocate for a powerful national government. His vision was perhaps the most radical of all, bordering on a kind of elected monarchy. But his intellectual firepower was undeniable. Massachusetts sent men like Elbridge, Gerry, and Rufus King. From South Carolina came the aristocratic Pinckney cousins and John Rutledge. Each delegate brought his own experiences, his own regional interests, and his own vision for what America should be. The variety was staggering. There were slaveholders from the South and merchants from the North. There were ardent nationalists who believed a strong central government was the only path to survival, and there were those deeply suspicious of centralized power, fearing it would become another form of the tyranny they had just fought a war to escape. These were not demigods who all agreed. They were brilliant, flawed, passionate human beings, and they were about to engage in one of the most intense and important debates in human history. But one state was conspicuously absent. Rhode Island, known by its neighbors as Rogue Island, it was fiercely independent and deeply suspicious of any national authority that might interfere with its interests, particularly its lucrative and often shady trade practices. The state legislature, dominated by a rural, populist faction, flatly refused to send delegates. They feared a strong national government would impose taxes, regulate their commerce, and threaten their autonomy. Their empty chairs served as a constant reminder of the fragility of the Union and the immense challenge of achieving consensus. The convention would have to proceed without them, hoping that what they created would be compelling enough for Rhode Island and everyone else to eventually join. And so, by the end of May 1787, the stage was set. The players had arrived. The doors were shut, the windows sealed. In the oppressive heat of a Philadelphia summer under a strict vow of secrecy, a small group of men gathered to debate, to argue, to compromise, and ultimately to create a framework for a government that would endure for centuries. They were about to begin the Constitutional Convention. The gathering was complete, and the future of America was hanging in the balance. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The debates are about to begin, and they will be fiery. If you're enjoying this deep dive into American history, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where the Virginia Plan is unveiled and the battle for the soul of the new nation truly begins. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our series on the birth of a nation. Today, in Chapter 7, we're pulling back the curtain on the assembly of giants, the Founding Fathers. Imagine a room in Philadelphia in the sweltering summer of 1787. The windows are sealed shut to ensure secrecy. The fate of a fledgling nation hangs in the balance. Who are the men tasked with this monumental undertaking? Let's meet them. First, presiding over this historic convention was a figure no one could question: George Washington. His presence alone commanded respect. After leading the Continental Army to a miraculous victory, Washington was the embodiment of American virtue and leadership. His quiet, steady hand as the convention's president was crucial. He didn't speak much during the debates, but when he did, everyone listened. His role was to guide the proceedings, to be the calm center of the storm, ensuring that the intense, often heated arguments never spiraled out of control. He was the anchor, the universally trusted leader who lent legitimacy to the entire endeavor. Without Washington at the helm, it's very likely the convention would have fractured before it even truly began. He was, in every sense, the indispensable man, not just on the battlefield, but in the halls of power. Next, we have the wise old sage of the group, the venerable Benjamin Franklin. At 81 years old, he was the elder statesman, a world-renowned scientist, diplomat, and writer. Plagued by gout and often in pain, he had to be carried into the hall each day in a special sedan chair, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Franklin wasn't a firebrand debater like some of the younger delegates. Instead, he was the voice of wisdom and compromise. He often used humor and allegorical stories to diffuse tension and gently guide his colleagues toward a middle ground. He was a constant reminder that for this new government to succeed, everyone would have to give a little. His final speech, where he urged every member to doubt a little of his own infallibility, is a method in diplomacy and a perfect encapsulation of his role. Franklin was the convention's conscience, its grandfatherly figure, whose experience and wit were invaluable in bridging the divides between factions. Now, let's turn to the intellectual powerhouse, the man often called the father of the Constitution, James Madison. If Washington was the anchor and Franklin the conscience, Madison was the architect. This Virginian was small in stature but a giant in intellect. He arrived in Philadelphia weeks before anyone else, armed with a mountain of research on the history of governments, from ancient Greece to contemporary Europe. He had already drafted the Virginia Plan, which became the foundational blueprint for the entire debate. Madison wasn't just a theorist. He was a master politician and a tireless note-taker. His detailed records of the convention as secret proceedings are the main reason we know so much about what happened behind those closed doors. Throughout the summer, he spoke more than any other delegate, relentlessly arguing for a strong but balanced national government. His vision, his preparation, and his sheer intellectual force shaped the Constitution more than any other single individual. Then there was the brilliant and ambitious Alexander Hamilton from New York. If Madison was the meticulous architect, Hamilton was the audacious visionary. He was impatient with the slow pace of debate and the caution of his colleagues. Hamilton believed in a powerful, centralized national government, even more powerful than what was ultimately created. He famously delivered a 6-hour speech arguing for a system modeled on the British monarchy, with the president and senators serving for life. While his radical ideas were largely rejected by the convention, they served a crucial purpose. They pushed the boundaries of the conversation and made Madison's Virginia Plan seem moderate and reasonable by comparison. Hamilton was a financial genius and a fervent nationalist who foresaw America's potential as a great commercial and military power. His contributions would become even more critical after the Constitution was written, as he co-authored the Federalist Papers and served as the first Secretary of the Treasury. laying the financial groundwork for the new nation. He was the spark, the firebrand who dreamed bigger than anyone else. Of course, these four were not alone. The room was filled with dozens of other remarkable men. There was Governor Maurice of Pennsylvania, the penman of the Constitution. He was a flamboyant character with a wooden leg and a razor-sharp wit. While Madison provided the ideas, it was Maurice who took the jumble of resolutions and polished them into the eloquent, final draft of the Constitution. The powerful and poetic preamble, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, ... That was largely Maurice's handiwork. He was a staunch nationalist who spoke more frequently than even Madison, always arguing for a strong, aristocratic government to check the turbulence of the common people. We also have Roger Sherm of Connecticut, a shoemaker-turned-lawer, who's the only person to sign all four great state papers of the U.S. The Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. He was a practical, no-nonsense man known for his legislative skill. Sherman was the architect of the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. This brilliant proposal broke a major deadlock between large and small states by creating our bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate where each state had equal representation. Without Sherman's pragmatic solution, the entire convention might have collapsed. He was the master negotiator, the man who found the practical path forward when ideology threatened to tear the convention apart. And there were so many others. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, a legal scholar whose theories on popular sovereignty were deeply influential. John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, who brought his cautious and deliberate mind to the proceedings. And the Rutledges and Pinckneys of South Carolina, who fiercely defended the interests of the southern states. Each delegate brought their own experiences, prejudices, and visions for the new republic. They were lawyers, merchants, and farmers. They were Federalists and They were men of deep principle who disagreed passionately on the very nature of government, liberty, and power. The assembly of these men in Philadelphia was nothing short of extraordinary. It was a collection of some of the finest political minds of the 18th century, all gathered in one room for one purpose: to save their new nation from falling apart. The summer of 1787 was a crucible, a trial by fire where personalities clashed, ideologies collided, and compromises were painfully forged. In our next chapter, we'll dive into the heart of those debates, exploring the great arguments that would ultimately shape the United States Constitution. Thank you so much for joining us on this historical journey. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the Constitutional Convention. If you've been following along, we've set the stage in Philadelphia. The year is 1787. The windows of the State House are sealed shut, and the fate of a new nation hangs in the balance. Today, we dive into the moment that truly kicked off the debate, the moment a bold vision for America was laid on the table. This is the story of the Virginia Plan. Just picture it. The delegates have gathered. The initial rules are set, and an air of anticipation fills the room. Then, on May 29th, Virginia's handsome and eloquent governor, Edmund Randolph, rises to speak, but the words he's about to deliver, the ideas that will shape the next 3 months of intense debate, are largely the brainchild of another, more reserved Virginian, the brilliant James Madison. Madison had arrived in Philadelphia, armed and ready. He hadn't just come to tweak the Articles of Confederation. He came to replace them entirely. For months, he had been studying ancient and modern republics, dissecting their successes and, more importantly, their failures. He concluded that a weak central government, like the one under the Articles, was doomed to fail. Factionalism, state squabbles, and an inability to act decisively were tearing the young country apart. What America needed, Madison believed, was a strong national government. So, as Randolph spoke for hours, he wasn't just pointing out the flaws of the current system. He was presenting a revolutionary blueprint for a new one. This blueprint, consisting of 15 resolutions, would come to be known as the Virginia Plan, or sometimes the Large State Plan, and it hit the convention like a thunderclap. Let's break down what made it so radical? The centerpiece of the Virginia Plan was the creation of a powerful national government with three distinct branches: a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch. This structure, which we now take for granted, was a massive departure from the single-body Congress of the Confederation. The idea was to create a system of checks and balances, where each branch could limit the power of the others, preventing any one part of the government from becoming too tyrannical. First, let's look at the legislative branch. The Virginia Plan proposed a bicameral legislature, meaning a Congress with two houses, just like we have today, the House of Representatives and the Senate. But here is the crucial detail that sparked immediate controversy. Representation in both houses would be based on population. This meant that states with more people, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, would get more representatives and therefore more power. You can imagine how the delegates from smaller states like Delaware, New Jersey, and Rhode Island felt about this. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state got one vote, regardless of its size. The Virginia Plan threatened to completely sideline them. Their voices, they feared, would be drowned out by the large, populous states. This issue of representation proportional versus equal would become the single most contentious point of the entire convention, a battle that we will explore in great detail in our upcoming episodes. The plan proposed that the members of the first house, what we might call the lower house, would be elected directly by the people. This was another democratic leap forward. The members of this first house would then elect the members of the second, or upper house, from a pool of candidates nominated by the state legislatures. So, you have a mix of direct and indirect democracy at play. Next up was the executive branch. The Virginia Plan was surprisingly vague here. It called for a national executive, but didn't specify whether this would be a single person, like a president or a committee. It also didn't define the exact length of the term or how the executive would be chosen, leaving that to be determined by the legislature. What it did make clear was that this executive would have the power to enforce national laws, a real authority that the old Congress desperately lacked. The very idea of a strong, independent executive was scary for many delegates who had just fought a war to escape the rule of a king. Finally, the judicial branch. The plan called for a national judiciary consisting of a supreme tribunal and other lower courts. These judges would hold their offices during good behavior, meaning they couldn't be easily fired for political reasons, ensuring their independence. This national court system would have the authority to hear cases related to national laws and issues between states, creating a final arbiter of justice that was above any single state court. This was another revolutionary step in creating a unified legal framework for the entire country. But Madison's plan had one more powerhouse feature: a national veto. The Virginia Plan proposed that the national legislature would have the power to veto any state law it deemed unconstitutional. Think about that for a second. Congress could simply strike down a law passed by any state. Furthermore, it proposed a council of revision made up of the national executive and some national judges, which could veto laws passed by the national legislature itself. This was a direct and powerful check on both state and federal power. The introduction of the Virginia Plan fundamentally shifted the conversation. The delegates were no longer just talking about fixing the Articles of Confederation. They were now debating the very structure of a new, powerful, and consolidated national government. It set the agenda for the entire summer. Every proposal, every argument, and every compromise that followed would be a reaction to the ideas first laid out by Madison and Randolph. It was a bold, ambitious, and, for many, a terrifying vision. It proposed a government far stronger than anything they had ever known. The smaller states immediately began to strategize, preparing to fight for their survival and their voice in this new union. The stage was set for a dramatic conflict of ideas and interests. What would the small states do? How would they respond to this challenge from Virginia? That's where we'll pick up next time, as we explore the counter-proposal that would go head-to-head with Madison's vision, the New Jersey Plan. The battle for America's future was just beginning. Thanks so much for watching. If you're finding this journey through constitutional history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. And make sure you resubscribe with notifications on so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to our deep dive into the birth of the American government. In our last chapter, we we saw the Virginia Plan take center stage, proposing a radical new system where representation in Congress would be based on a state's population. For large states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, this was fantastic news. More people meant more power, more influence, and a greater say in the nation's future. It seemed logical, fair, and a clear step forward from the weak Articles of Confederation. But imagine you're a delegate from a state like Delaware, New Jersey, or Rhode Island. As you've listened to Edmund Randolph lay out the Virginia Plan, a knot of dread would have likely formed in your stomach. A government based purely on population. That sounded less like a union of equal states and more like a permanent domination by the big players. Your small state's voice, your unique interests, your very identity could be completely swallowed up, reduced to a mere whisper in the halls of power. The delegates from these smaller states looked at each other, the alarm clear in their eyes. They knew they couldn't let this happen. If the new United States was to be a true federation, a partnership, then every partner needed to have a meaningful say. The battle lines were being drawn, not between North and South, but between big and small. The Constitutional Convention was about to face its first major crisis, and the small states were ready to fight back, their weapon of choice. A counter-proposal that would champion the principle of state equality above all else. This was the genesis of the New Jersey Plan. On June 15, 1787, just a few weeks after the Virginia Plan was introduced, a new voice rose to challenge it. That voice belonged to William Paterson, a delegate from New Jersey. Paterson wasn't just speaking for his home state. He was speaking for every small state that felt threatened by the prospect of being marginalized. He stood before the convention and presented what would become known as the New Jersey Plan, though it was also called the Small State Plan or the Paterson Plan. This wasn't just a minor tweak to the Virginia Plan. It was a fundamental rejection of its core principle. Instead of throwing out the Articles of Confederation entirely, the New Jersey Plan proposed to amend them. It was a more conservative, more cautious approach. It acknowledged the need for a stronger national government, but was terrified of creating a national monster that would devour the states. The plan agreed that the federal government needed more power, specifically the power to tax and to regulate commerce between the states, two of the biggest weaknesses of the Articles. But when it came to the structure of the legislature, Paterson drew a hard line. He proposed keeping the unicameral, or one house, Congress that already existed under the Articles. And here was the crucial point, the hill the small states were willing to die on. In this Congress, every single state would have one vote, equal representation. Delaware, with its tiny population, would have the exact same legislative power as the giant state of Virginia. The United States was a compact between sovereign states, not a single nation of people. The debate that followed was one of the most intense and heated of the entire convention. The room was thick with tension. James Madison, the architect of the Virginia Plan, argued fiercely against Paterson's proposal. He saw it as fundamentally unjust. How could it be fair, he asked, for 70,000 people in Delaware to have the same power as over 700,000 people in Virginia? He argued that the government's power came from the people, not the states, and therefore representation should be proportional to the people. On the other side, delegates like Gunning Bedford Jr. of Delaware made their position chillingly clear. He famously declared that if the large states insisted on their plan and dissolved the Confederation, the small states would find some foreign ally of more honor and good faith, who will take them by the hand and do them justice. This was a shocking statement to Thinnyvale, a threat that the small states would rather align with a European power than be crushed by their larger American neighbors. It showed just how deep the division ran. The big states wouldn't budge on proportional representation, and the small states wouldn't budge on equal representation. For a moment, it seemed like the entire American experiment was about to collapse before it had even truly begun. The dream of a more perfect union was teetering on the brink of failure. Neither side seemed willing to compromise, and the Philadelphia summer heat only added to the rising tempers. The core of this conflict wasn't just about power. It was about two competing visions for America. The Virginia Plan envisioned a strong, consolidated national republic where state loyalties would gradually fade in favor of a single American identity. Power would flow from the people directly to the national government. The New Jersey Plan, however, clung to a federalist vision, a league of states. It saw the states as the essential building blocks of the Union, each retaining a significant degree of its own sovereignty. The delegates were grappling with the question we still debate today. Where does ultimate authority lie? With the national government or with the states? For the small states, giving up equal representation felt like giving up their very existence. They feared their local laws, their economies, and their unique cultures would be overridden by a national majority that didn't understand or care about their specific needs. Imagine a New Jersey farmer being subjected to laws written primarily to benefit Virginia plantation owners. That was the nightmare scenario they were desperate to avoid. It argued that the Union was a partnership, and in a partnership, you don't give the biggest partner all the votes. This principle was the heart and soul of their argument, and they defended it with a passion born of fear and a fierce sense of self. So, what exactly did the New Jersey plan propose besides equal representation in a single-house legislature? Let's break it down. This was a crucial concession, admitting that the central government under the Articles was too weak to handle the nation's finances and economic disputes. It also proposed a federal executive, but not a single president like we have today. Instead, it called for an executive council, a committee of people chosen by Congress. The plan also included a federal judiciary with a Supreme Court, which would have the power to handle cases related to treaties and federal law. In many ways, it was a significant upgrade from the Articles of Confederation. The national government's power was enhanced, but it was still fundamentally a creature of the states. The members of Congress would be chosen by the state legislatures, not directly by the people, reinforcing the idea that they were representatives of their states, not their constituents. The New Jersey plan was a bold attempt to find a middle ground to fix the problems of the Articles without completely abandoning their underlying principle of state sovereignty. It was a bridge between the old Confederation and a new, more powerful nation. The large states, with their greater number of delegates, held firm. It was a major victory for Madison and the nationalists. It seemed, for a moment, that the idea of proportional representation had won the day. The convention officially decided to move forward with the basic framework of the Virginia Plan, aiming to create a new national government rather than just patching up the old Articles. For the delegates from the small states, this was a devastating blow. Their worst fears seemed to be coming true. They had put forward what they considered a reasonable compromise, and it had been squarely rejected. The atmosphere in Independence Hall grew even more somber. The convention was on the verge of dissolving, but the story doesn't end there. The defeat of the New Jersey Plan was not the end of the debate. In a way, it was the end of the beginning. It forced everyone in the room to confront the reality that neither the Virginia Plan nor the New Jersey Plan, in their pure forms, could secure the unanimous agreement needed to create a new constitution. The large states had the votes to push their plan through, but they couldn't force the small states to accept it. The small states didn't have the votes, but their threat to walk away was very real. A union without them would be incomplete and weak. The deadlock had to be broken. Everyone knew it. The rejection of the New Jersey Plan cleared the way for the next, and perhaps most crucial, phase of the convention. The search for a compromise. The ideas presented by William Madison didn't just vanish. They remained on the table, a constant reminder that the interests of the small states had to be accommodated. This set the stage for one of the most brilliant moments in American political history. The Great Compromise. So, what is the lasting legacy of the New Jersey Plan? Even though it was defeated, its impact on the final Constitution was immense. It served as a powerful and necessary counterbalance to the nationalism of the Virginia Plan. It forced the convention to move away from a winner-take-all mentality and embrace the art of compromise. The very existence of our modern Senate is a direct result of the arguments put forth in the New Jersey Plan. As we'll see in our next chapter, on the Great Compromise, the final structure of Congress with a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate, where each state gets 2 votes, is a beautiful hybrid of the 2 competing plans. The House satisfies the Virginia Plan's call for representation by the people, while the Senate embodies the New Jersey Plan's demand for the equal representation of the states. Without the fierce resistance from William Madison in the small states, the U.S. Senate as we know it would not exist. The federal system we have today, with its delicate balance of power between the national government and the states, owes a tremendous debt to the Federalist vision championed by the New Jersey Plan. It ensured that the United States would be a compound republic, as Madison later called it, both national and federal, a government of the people and a government of the states. The New Jersey plan may have lost the vote, but it won a crucial part of the argument, shaping the very fabric of American government and ensuring that even the smallest states would always have a powerful voice in the nation's capital. It's a powerful lesson in how, even in defeat, a well-argued principle can fundamentally alter the course of history. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the Constitutional Convention. The debate between the big and small states was a true crisis point for the young nation. What do you think? Was the New Jersey plan a fair proposal, or was Madison right that it was undemocratic? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. In our next chapter, we'll witness the dramatic breakthrough that saved the convention. The Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. It is a story of political genius and a willingness to put the country's future ahead of narrow interests. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into a moment so critical, so tense, that the entire future of the United States hung in the balance. This is the story of Chapter 10, The Great Compromise. Imagine this. It's the scorching summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. The windows of the State House are nailed shut to keep prying ears out, and inside, tempers are flaring. The nation's greatest mindsmen, like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin, are at a complete standstill. They had gathered to fix the broken Articles of Confederation, but now they were trying to build a whole new government from scratch. The problem: they couldn't agree on what that government should look like. Specifically, how would the people be represented? This wasn't just some abstract political debate. It was a fundamental clash of interests between the big states and the small states. On one side, you had states like Virginia, with its large population. They championed the Virginia Plan, proposed by Edmund Randolph, but largely the brainchild of James Madison. The Virginia Plan called for a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 houses of Congress, where representation in both houses would be based on a state's population. Naturally, the big states loved this idea. More people meant more power, more votes, more influence. To them, it was simple fairness. Representation should reflect the population. If you have more citizens, you should have a louder voice in the national government. But on the other side of the aisle were the smaller states, like New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut. They were terrified. They looked at the Virginia Plan and saw a recipe for their own extinction. They feared that the larger states would band together and dominate the national government, passing laws that benefited them at the expense of the smaller states. Their concerns were very real. How could little Delaware ever stand up to the combined might of Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania? In response, William Paterson of New Jersey presented his own proposal, the New Jersey Plan. This plan called for a legislature, just 1 house of Congress where every single state, regardless of its size, would have 1 vote. Equal representation. This was essentially the system they had under the Articles of Confederation. And for the small states, it was their shield against being overpowered. They argued that the United States was a union of individual, sovereign states, and each state should have an equal say in the nation's affairs. To them, the Virginia Plan looked like a hostile takeover. So, here we are, deadlocked. The convention was on the brink of collapse. Delegates were threatening to walk out. Letters were written home, filled with despair. 4 weeks, the debate raged on. The Virginia Plan versus the New Jersey Plan. Population versus equality. Large states versus small states. It seemed like there was no middle ground. The American experiment was about to fail before it had even truly begun. George Washington, presiding over the convention, was said to have been deeply worried, fearing that all the sacrifices of the Revolution might have been for nothing. The atmosphere was so toxic that Benjamin Franklin, ever the peacemaker, even suggested that they begin each session with a prayer, hoping for some divine intervention to guide them out of this mess. The delegates were exhausted, frustrated, and running out of ideas. It was in this moment of crisis that a solution began to emerge, a compromise that would save the convention and, in many ways, save the United Two States itself. Enter the heroes of our story, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut. These weren't the most famous names at the convention, but their contribution was perhaps the most crucial. They looked at the two opposing plans and thought, what if we don't have to choose? What if we can take the best of both? They pieced together a proposal that would become known as the Connecticut Compromise, or, more famously, the Great Compromise. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Let's not have one house or the other. Let's have both. The Great Compromise proposed a bicameral legislature, just like the Virginia plan. But here was the genius twist. The two houses would be structured differently, satisfying both camps. First, there would be a lower house, which we now call the House of Representatives. In this chamber, representation would be based on population. The number of representatives a state gets would be directly tied to the number of people living in it. This was a huge win for the large states. Their argument for proportional representation was honored. This house would be the people's chamber, directly elected and closely tied to the will of the populace. But then there was the second house, the upper house, which we now call the Senate. In Dieci Senati, every state would have equal representation. 2 senators per state, regardless of its size. Virginia, with its massive population, would get 2 senators. Tiny Rhode Island, which hadn't even sent delegates to the convention, would also get 2 senators. This was the lifeline the small states desperately needed. This chamber would act as a check on the power of the larger states, ensuring that their interests would always have a voice and a vote. The Senate would be the guardian of state sovereignty. It was a master stroke of political negotiation. The Great Compromise didn't give either side everything they wanted, but it gave both sides enough to be willing to move forward. The large states got their proportional representation in the House, which would have primary control over issues of taxation and spending the power of the purse. The small states got their equal representation in the Senate, which would have key powers like approving treaties and confirming presidential appointments. The debate over the compromise was intense. Some hardliners on both sides were still unhappy. But on July 16, 1787, the convention voted. The Great Compromise passed by a single, razor-thin vote. The sigh of relief in that hot, stuffy room must have been incredible. The deadlock was broken. The convention was saved. The Great Compromise did more than just create our modern Congress. It established a fundamental principle of American government, the balancing of different forms of representation. It created a system where the voice of the majority is heard, but the rights of the minority are protected. It's a delicate balancing act that continues to shape our political landscape to this very day. When you hear debates about the Senate filibuster or the Electoral College, you're hearing echoes of this 230-year-old argument between the big states and the small states. The structure of Congress, with its 2 distinct houses, forces deliberation and encourages compromise. A bill must pass through the House, representing the immediate will of the people, and also through the Senate, representing the broader, more stable interests of the states. This dual-track system was designed to be slow and methodical, preventing any one faction from gaining too much power too quickly. So, the next time you look at the U.S. Capitol building, with its 2 separate wings for the House and the Senate, remember the summer of 1787? Remember the shouting, the frustration, and the looming threat of failure. And remember the clever, pragmatic delegates from Connecticut who stitched together a solution from 2 seemingly impossible positions. The Great Compromise wasn't just a political deal. It was the essential glue that held the fragile new nation together, allowing the delegates to move on and complete the incredible task of drafting the United States Constitution. It stands as a powerful testament to the idea that even in our most divided moments, progress is possible through reason, respect, and the art of compromise. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our history. It's a story that's as relevant today as it was then. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We have so much more to explore together. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we are tackling one of the most difficult and consequential chapters of the Constitutional Convention. The 3 compromise. Compromise. It's a topic that forces us to confront the deep, painful contradictions at the heart of the nation's founding. As the summer of 1787 wore on in Philadelphia, the delegates were locked in a fierce debate. They had just hammered out the Great Compromise, creating the House of Representatives and the Senate. But a new, even more divisive question immediately arose. How would the population of each state be counted to determine its number of representatives in the House? This wasn't just a math problem. It was a battle over power and the moral stain of slavery. The Southern delegates, from states whose economies were built on the labor of enslaved people, made a shocking demand. They insisted that enslaved individuals, who were legally considered property and had no rights, should be counted as part of their total population. Now, why would they want this? It wasn't out of a sudden recognition of the humanity of the people they enslaved. It was a cold, calculated political move. More people meant more representatives in the House, and more representatives meant more power to protect their economic interests. Chief among them, the institution of slavery itself. The Northern delegates were appalled. They argued, quite logically, that it was the height of hypocrisy to treat people as property for every purpose except when it came to gaining political power. Massachusetts, Delegate Elbridge, Gary put it bluntly. If enslaved people were to be counted as men for representation, then why not make them citizens and let them vote? He asked if the North should be allowed to count its cattle and horses to increase its own representation. The argument exposed a brutal reality. The South wanted to have it both ways, to deny the humanity of enslaved people while simultaneously using their numbers to dominate the new government. The convention reached a dangerous impasse. The debate grew so heated that delegates from the South threatened to walk out and abandon the entire project of creating a new nation. The dream of a more perfect union was on the brink of collapse. The delegates were faced with a terrible choice: compromise on their principles or risk the dissolution of the country before it even began. This is where James Wilson of Pennsylvania and Charles Pinckney of South Carolina stepped in. They revived a formula that had been proposed a few years earlier under the Articles of Confederation for a different purpose: taxation. The idea was a grim, mathematical solution to a deeply moral problem. This became known as the 3/5 Compromise. The compromise stated that for the purposes of both representation in the House and for levying direct taxes, you would count the whole number of free persons, and then add to that 3/5 of all other persons. Those other persons was the carefully chosen, sanitized language for enslaved African Americans. So, for every 5 enslaved people in a state, 3 would be added to the population count for representation. Think about the chilling arithmetic of that. An enslaved person was counted as only 60% of a human being for the purpose of giving their enslaver more political power. It was a deal that wrote inequality and racial hierarchy directly into the nation's founding document. The South got the increased representation it craved, giving it a disproportionate influence in Congress and the Electoral College for decades to come. The North, in theory, got the South to agree to be taxed on the same basis. But direct federal taxes were rare in the early republic, so this was a small concession. Why did the Northern delegates agree to such a morally repugnant deal? For many, it was a pragmatic, if agonizing, decision. They believed it was the only way to keep the Southern states in the Union. They hoped that by creating a strong national government, the issue of slavery could be dealt with later. They gambled that the Union itself was more important than immediate justice. This compromise had profound and lasting consequences. It embedded the power of the slave power, as it came to be known, deep within the American political system. This extra representation allowed Southern states to protect slavery by blocking anti-slavery legislation for decades. It ensured that a disproportionate number of presidents, House speakers, and Supreme Court justices were from the South. In many ways, the road to the Civil War was paved by the political power granted by the 3/5 Compromise. It's a stark reminder that our Constitution, while a remarkable document, is also a product of its time, full of compromises made by imperfect people. The 3/5 Compromise is not a proud moment in American history, but it's one we must understand. It reveals the deep-seated conflicts and moral failures that were present at the nation's birth, and which we have been wrestling with ever since. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the price of unity and the legacy of compromises made at the expense of human freedom. Thank you for joining me for this difficult but essential chapter. Understanding these moments is key to understanding the America we live in today. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like. Subscribe for more deep dives into history, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the making of America. Last time, we explored the fiery debates that forged Congress. But today, we're tackling an even bigger question, one that stumped the Constitutional Convention for weeks. How do you create a president? Imagine you're in that hot, stuffy room in Philadelphia. Summer of 1787. You've just designed a legislature, but now you need an executive. A single person to lead the new nation. The stakes couldn't be higher. Give this office too much power, and you've just created a new king. The very thing you fought a revolution to escape. Give it too little power, and the government will be weak and ineffective, unable to act decisively. It was a true political tightrope walk. The first major hurdle was the selection process. How do you choose this president? The delegates threw around several ideas, and each one came with its own set of problems. The simplest idea, proposed by some, was to have Congress choose the president. This seems straightforward. The people elect Congress, and Congress, being a body of wise representatives, would then select a capable leader. But wait a minute, said others, like Governor Maurice. If Congress picks the president, won't the president just become a puppet? They'd be constantly trying to please the legislators to get reelected, not serving the people. It could lead to backroom deals, corruption, and a weak executive branch totally dependent on the legislative. This idea threatened the whole principle of separation of powers they were trying so hard to establish. So, that was a no-go for many. All right, so if not Congress, what about the most democratic option? A direct popular vote. Let the people decide. This sounds great to us today, right? But for the delegates, it was a radical and even dangerous idea. Remember, this was the 18th century. The country was vast, and communication was slow. How would a farmer in Georgia know anything about a candidate from Massachusetts? They worried that people would just vote for their local hero, a favorite son. The larger states, with their bigger populations, would dominate every election, leaving smaller states with no voice at all. Plus, there was a genuine fear among the elite delegates that the general populace could be too easily swayed by a charismatic demagogue, a smooth talker who could manipulate them into making a poor choice. So, direct popular vote was also pushed aside. They were stuck. Election by Congress was a path to corruption. Election by the people was a path to chaos. Or so they feared. They needed a compromise, a third way. And this is where one of the most ingenious and now most controversial parts of the Constitution was born. The Electoral College. James Wilson of Pennsylvania was a key architect of this compromise. The idea was this: each state would be given a number of electors. That number would be equal to its total number of representatives in the House, plus its 2 senators. How each state chose its electors was up to the state itself. They could be chosen by the state legislature or by a popular vote within the state. These electors would then meet in their own states and cast 2 votes for president. At least one of those votes had to be for someone outside their home state. A clever rule to prevent that favorite son problem we talked about. The votes would then be sent to Congress to be counted. The person with the most votes, provided it was a majority, would become president. The person with the second most votes would become vice president. It was a brilliant, if complicated, solution for its time. It was a compromise between a congressional vote and a popular vote. It gave power to both the individual states and the people. It ensured that small states weren't completely overpowered by large states. It also created a buffer, a group of supposedly wise and discerning electors between the raw popular vote and the final decision, calming the fears of those who distrusted pure democracy. Of course, if no candidate won a majority of electoral votes, the decision would be thrown to the House of Representatives, with each state delegation getting 1 vote. This was the ultimate safety net. Now, as they were designing this intricate system, there was an elephant in the room. Or rather, a giant of a man. Everyone knew who the first president would be. The debates were intense, but they were happening under the silent, looming shadow of one person, George Washington. Washington was the hero of the Revolution, the most trusted and admired man in the entire country. His presence at the convention gave it legitimacy. The delegates were essentially designing the presidency ** for him. ** they trusted him implicitly. They knew he wouldn't abuse the power. They could grant the office significant authority to be commander-in-chief, to negotiate treaties, to appoint officials because they could picture Washington in the role, wielding that power with restraint and wisdom. It's a fascinating thought. Would the presidency be as powerful as it is today if Washington had UNP there, serving as the unspoken prototype? Probably not. This new office, the presidency, was a truly American invention. It was unlike a king who inherits power for life, and it was unlike a prime minister who is chosen from and serves at the pleasure of the legislature. This was a single executive, chosen for a fixed term, independent of Congress, and responsible to the people through the complex mechanism of the Electoral College. It was a bold experiment. And so, with the design complete, the stage was set. The Constitution was ratified, and in 1789, the first ever presidential election took place. As everyone expected, every single elector casts one of their votes for George Washington. He was unanimously elected. John Adams, receiving the second highest number of votes, became the first vice president. The great American experiment in executive leadership had begun. The system they created has been tweaked over the years, most notably with the 12th Amendment, which changed the voting process to have electors vote separately for president and vice president after the messy election of 1800. And the Electoral College remains a topic of fierce debate to this very day. But it's a direct legacy of those delegates in 1787, trying to balance power, democracy, and stability. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into the heart of the Constitutional Convention. It's incredible to think about how these decisions, made over 200 years ago, continue to shape our world. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Have you ever wondered who has the final say in the American government? Is it the president? Congress? Well, today we're diving deep into the fascinating world of the U.S. judicial branch and how it acts as the ultimate referee in the grand game of American democracy. Welcome to our series on the foundations of government. Let's travel back to the late 1780s. The framers of the Constitution were walking a tightrope. They'd just escaped the rule of a king and were terrified of creating a new form of tyranny. Their big idea: separation of powers. They split the government into three branches. The legislative branch, Congress, to make the laws; the executive branch, the president, to enforce the laws; and the judicial branch, the courts, to interpret the laws. The goal was to ensure no single branch could become all-powerful. It was a revolutionary concept of checks and balances. Now, think about the judicial branch. The Constitution, in Article 3, is surprisingly brief about it. It establishes one Supreme Court and gives Congress the power to create lower federal courts, but it left a lot of details open. The real genius lies in what it asterisked. Did asterisk specify federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, would hold their positions during good behavior? What does that mean? Essentially, it's a lifetime appointment. They couldn't be fired by a president they disagree with or voted out by a public that dislikes their rulings. They can only be removed through a difficult impeachment process for serious misconduct. Why this lifetime tenure? The framers wanted to create a truly independent judiciary. They knew that if judges had to worry about pleasing voters or politicians to keep their jobs, their decisions could be swayed by popular opinion or political pressure rather than the rule of law. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers argued passionately for this. He called the judiciary the least dangerous branch because it controlled neither the sword, the military, nor the purse, the budget. Its power, he said, rested solely on its judgment and its ability to persuade people that its interpretations of the law were correct and just. This independence allows judges to make tough, sometimes unpopular, decisions to protect the rights of minorities and uphold the Constitution, even when it goes against the will of the majority. So, how does this independent judiciary actually balance the other two branches? This is where the magic of judicial review comes in. Now, you won't find the term judicial review explicitly written in the Constitution. It was established in the landmark 1803 Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, In this incredibly clever ruling, Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Supreme Court had the authority to review laws passed by Congress and actions taken by the President to determine if they were constitutional. If a law or action violates the Constitution, the court can strike it down, rendering it void. Think about the sheer power of that. Congress can pass a law with overwhelming support, and the president can sign it. But if the Supreme Court finds it unconstitutional, that law is gone. This is the judiciary's ultimate check on the legislative and executive branches. For example, the court can strike down a law that it believes infringes on freedom of speech or an executive order that oversteps the president's authority. This power ensures that the Constitution remains the supreme law of the land, and that no politician or law is above it. It's the mechanism that forces the other branches to stay within their designated lanes. But wait, does this make the judiciary all-powerful? Not at all. The system of checks and balances is a two-way, or rather, a three-way street. The other branches have significant checks on the judiciary as well. First, who gets to be a judge? The president nominates federal judges, but the Senate must confirm them. This process is a huge check. It ensures that the judiciary's makeup is influenced by the elected branches, reflecting, over time, the will of the people. A president can't just install anyone they want. They need the Senate's approval, which often involves intense hearings and political negotiation. Furthermore, if the Supreme Court interprets a law in a way that Congress doesn't like, Congress can pass a new law to clarify its intent or even begin the long and difficult process of amending the Constitution itself. For instance, after the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which denied citizenship to African Americans, the 14th Amendment was eventually passed to overturn that ruling and guarantee citizenship and equal protection. And let's not forget the power of enforcement. The courts have no army or police force. They rely on the executive branch to enforce their rulings. This was famously highlighted when President Andrew Jackson reportedly defied a Supreme Court ruling, saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." While this is a rare and extreme example, it illustrates the judiciary's dependence on the other branches to give its decisions practical effect. So, you see, it's not a simple hierarchy. It's a complex, dynamic dance. The judiciary, led by the Supreme Court, acts as the guardian of the Constitution, checking the power of the President and Congress through judicial review. In turn, the President and Congress check the judiciary through the appointment process, the power to create new laws, the ability to amend the Constitution, and control over enforcement. This intricate web of checks and balances was designed to prevent any one part of the government from gaining absolute control. It creates a system of tension and compromise, forcing the branches to work with and against each other. The goal was never to create a perfectly efficient government, but a safe one. A government that protects liberty by making the abuse of power difficult. The independent judiciary is the linchpin of that design, ensuring that the rule of law, and not the whim of the powerful, prevails. It's a system that has been tested time and time again throughout American history, and its resilience is a testament to the foresight of the framers. It's what keeps the balance of power from tipping into tyranny. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this crucial aspect of American government. I hope this gives you a clearer understanding of why the judiciary is so vital. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. The air in Philadelphia hung thick and heavy, not just with the late summer humidity of September 1787, but with the weight of history. For 4 long grueling months, the Pennsylvania State House, now forever known as Independence Hall, had been a crucible. Inside its walls, the very future of a young nation was being forged, debated, and hammered into shape. Imagine the scene. A room filled with some of the most brilliant minds of the era, their voices echoing off the walls, a cacophony of passionate arguments, whispered compromises, and fervent pleas for unity. The dream of a more perfect union was on the line, and failure was not an option. This wasn't a gathering of gods, but of men. Men with differing opinions, regional allegiances, and profound fears about the balance of power. They had wrestled with monumental questions. How could a government be strong enough to command respect on the world stage, yet not so strong as to trample the rights of its own citizens? How could the interests of large, populous states be reconciled with the needs of smaller, less populated ones? Every clause, every sentence of the document we now call the Constitution was the result of intense negotiation and, at times, sheer exhaustion. The delegates were weary. The debates had been fierce, testing friendships and straining alliances. Men like James Madison, the father of the Constitution, had tirelessly recorded the proceedings, his hand cramping as he captured the intellectual combat. George Washington, presiding over the convention with a stoic and dignified presence, had maintained order through the sheer force of his character. And now, the final draft lay before them, a testament to their perseverance. It was a document born of compromise, an imperfect but audacious blueprint for a new form of government. On this day, September 17th, the moment of truth arrived. It was time to put quill to parchment. It was time to sign. Not every delegate present was willing. Some, like Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and George Mason of Virginia, could not bring themselves to endorse a document they believed was deeply flawed, particularly in its lack of a Bill of Rights. Their dissent was a powerful reminder of the deep divisions that still existed. Their refusal to sign wasn't an act of betrayal, but a principled stand, one that would ironically lead to the very Bill of Rights they so desperately wanted. But for the majority, the time for debate was over. The time for unity had come. One by one, the delegates stepped forward. As they approached the desk where the Constitution lay, the gravity of the moment was palpable. This wasn't just paper and ink. It was a pact, a promise to each other and to posterity. They were pledging their names, their reputations, and their sacred honor to this new experiment in self-governance. Think of the courage it took. They were creating a government unlike any that had ever existed, a republic on a scale never before attempted. There were no guarantees of success. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, and the memory of war was still fresh. To sign this document was to leap into the unknown, guided only by a shared belief in the principles of liberty and representative government. Among the signatories was the elder statesman of the group, the wise and witty Benjamin Franklin. At 81 years old, he was frail and often in pain, so much so that he had to be carried into the hall in a sedan chair. Throughout the convention, his wisdom and timely humor had often eased tensions and guided the delegates toward compromise. Now, as the last of the signatures were being affixed, his gaze fell upon the high-backed chair at the front of the room. The chair George Washington had occupied throughout the convention. Carved into the top of that chair was a small, decorative sun. Franklin confided in those around him that he had often looked at that sun during the contentious debates, wondering whether it was rising or setting. It was a powerful metaphor for the nation itself. Was this new American experiment dawning, full of promise and light, or was it descending into the twilight of failure, just another fleeting dream? As he watched the final delegate sign his name, a sense of clarity and hope washed over him. He turned to James Madison and said, "I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." What a profound and beautiful sentiment. In that moment, Franklin saw not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a new day for America. He saw the promise of a future where a government of the people, beat the people, for the people could not only survive, but thrive. The signing of the Constitution in Independence Hall was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the beginning. The document still had to be ratified by the states, a battle that would be just as fierce as the convention itself. But on that September day, a foundation was laid. A group of imperfect men, through sheer will and a spirit of compromise, had created a document that would become the cornerstone of American democracy and a beacon of hope for freedom-loving people around the world. They had looked at the horizon and, like Franklin, they had seen a rising sun. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this story as inspiring as we do, please hit that like button. And forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next chapter in history. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Last time, we witnessed the miracle of Philadelphia, the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. But here's the cliffhanger. That document, as brilliant as it was, wasn't the law of the land. Not yet. It was just a proposal, a piece of paper with a grand vision. To bring it to life, it had to survive a trial by fire, a nationwide battle of words and wills. This is the story of that fight. The epic struggle for ratification. Imagine the scene. September 1787. The delegates emerge from the convention, blinking in the sunlight, holding this radical new blueprint for a government. But instead of a victory parade, what they get is a political firestorm. The rules they set for themselves were audacious. They bypassed the existing state legislatures, who would likely reject a document that reduced their power. Instead, they declared that the Constitution would become law if just 9 of the 13 states approved it through special ratifying conventions. This was a historic scambly, and the nation immediately split into 2 passionate, fiercely opposed camps. The Federalists and the Let's meet the Federalists first. These were the champions of the Constitution. Think of them as the marketing team for this new government. Their lineup was a who's who of the Revolution's heavy hitters. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and ambitious New Yorker. James Madison, the intellectual architect of the Constitution itself. And John Jay, a seasoned diplomat. They saw the chaos under the Articles of Confederation, the weak economy. The social unrest, like Shays' Rebellion, believed that only a strong, centralized national government could save the young republic from falling apart. To them, the Constitution was the cure. It promised stability, a unified economic policy, and the ability to command respect on the world stage. They argued that a powerful federal government wasn't a threat to liberty, but its greatest protector. How could you have liberty without order? How could you have prosperity without a stable currency and the power to enforce treaties? These were the questions they posed to the American people, framing the debate as a choice between a united, effective nation and a descent back into squabbling, powerless states. Now, on the other side of the ring, we have the don't let the name fool you. These weren't simply contrarians. They were patriots who were deeply suspicious of centralized power. Many of them had just fought a war to escape the tyranny of a king and a distant parliament. Now, they looked at the Constitution and saw the potential for a new form of tyranny, just dressed in American clothes. Their ranks included legendary figures like Patrick Henry, the man who famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," and George Mason, a Virginia delegate who had refused to sign the Constitution. Their arguments were powerful and resonated with many ordinary Americans. Where was the Bill of Rights? They pointed out that the document had no explicit protections for fundamental freedoms like speech, religion, or trial by jury. They feared the new federal government, with its power to tax and raise a standing army, would crush the states and trample on individual liberties. They saw the presidency as a potential monarchy and the new federal court system as a threat to local justice. Their core message was a warning. We just threw off one powerful government. Are we really about to create another one? The stakes, they believed, were nothing less than the soul of the American Revolution. This wasn't just a polite debate among gentlemen in powdered wigs. It was a vicious, no-holds-barred public relations war fought in newspapers, pamphlets, and at the state ratifying conventions. And the Federalists had a secret weapon, one of the most brilliant works of political philosophy ever written. The Federalist Papers. Under the shared pseudonym Publius, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote a series of 85 essays published in New York newspapers. These weren't just attacks on their opponents. They were a masterclass, a detailed, clause-by-clause explanation and defense of the Constitution. Hamilton argued for a strong executive and federal power. Madison, in perhaps the most famous essay, Federalist No. 10, brilliantly tackled the fear of factions and argued that a large republic was actually the best defense against mob rule and special interests. The Federalist Papers took the abstract language of the Constitution and made it accessible, logical, and compelling. They transformed the debate, arming supporters with intellectual ammunition and persuading undecided citizens. The battle for ratification was fought state by state, and each one was a nail-biter. Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey ratified quickly in late 1787. But the real fight was in the large, influential states. In Massachusetts, the convention was deeply divided. The Anti-Federalists had strong support, especially in the rural western parts of the state. The tide only turned when Federalists proposed a brilliant compromise. Ratify the Constitution, now asterisk, and they would promise to immediately add a Bill of Rights as the very first order of business for the new government. This Massachusetts Compromise was a game-changer. It reassured many skeptics, and the state narrowly voted to ratify. This compromise became the key to victory. When the news reached New Hampshire in June of 1788, they became the critical ninth state to ratify. Technically, the Constitution was now the law of the land. But everyone knew that without the two largest and most powerful states, Virginia and New York, the new union was a house built on sand. The Virginia Convention was a clash of titans. On one side, Patrick Henry delivered thunderous speeches against the Constitution, painting a terrifying picture of lost liberty. On the other, James Madison, armed with his deep knowledge and calm reason, methodically dismantled the anti-federalist arguments. Once again, the promise of a future Bill of Rights proved decisive, and Virginia narrowly voted to approve. All eyes then turned to New York. Here, the anti-federalists were well organized and had a clear majority in the convention. Alexander Hamilton led a seemingly hopeless Federalist charge. For weeks, he debated, cajoled, and strategized. The turning point came when news arrived that both New Hampshire and Virginia had ratified. New York was now faced with a stark choice: join the new union or be left as an independent, isolated nation sandwiched between New England and the rest of the country. Faced with this reality, the opposition crumbled, and New York voted to ratify by the slimmest of margins, just 3 votes. The fight was over. The gamble had paid off. The battle for ratification was more than just a political struggle. It was a national conversation about the very meaning of America. It forced the country to debate its deepest fears and highest aspirations. And in the end, it produced a crucial outcome: the promise of a Bill of Rights. The anti-federalists may have lost the war, but they won a vital battle, ensuring that explicit protections for individual liberties would be woven into the very fabric of the new government. The Constitution was not just accepted, it was improved through the fire of this debate. The United States of America was finally, truly born. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most critical moments in American history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters in our journey. Drop a comment below. Were you Team Federalist or Team Anti-Federalist? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're re-diving into one of the most powerful and influential series of essays ever written: the Federalist Papers. Imagine this. The year is 1787. The Constitutional Convention has just wrapped up, presenting a radical new framework for the American government. But here's the catch. It's not law yet. 9 of the 13 states need to ratify it, and the public is deeply divided. People are scared. They just fought a revolution to escape a powerful central government. Will this new constitution create another monarchy? Will it trample on the rights of individuals and states? The future of the United States is literally hanging in the balance. In the midst of this heated debate, a series of brilliant essays begins to appear in New York newspapers. They are published under the pseudonym Publius, a name that harks back to a founder of the Roman Republic. The goal of these essays is clear: to persuade the American people, especially the skeptical citizens of New York, to support the new Constitution. For months, the identity of Publius remains a secret. Only later would the world learn that behind this single name were 3 of the sharpest minds of the era: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. These men weren't just politicians. They were architects of a nation, and the Federalist Papers were their blueprints, explained for all to see. Let's break down the team. First, you have Alexander Hamilton, the driving force behind the project. He was a tireless advocate for a strong national government. He believed that for the United States to survive and prosper, it needed a central authority capable of managing a national economy, conducting foreign policy, and maintaining order. Hamilton wrote the majority of the essays, around 51 of them, tackling everything from the powers of the executive branch to the need for a federal judiciary and a standing army. His arguments are energetic, pragmatic, and infused with a sense of urgency. He saw the chaos of the Articles of Confederation and was determined to prevent the young nation from falling apart. Then there's James Madison. Often called the father of the Constitution, Madison's contributions were profound. He wrote about 29 essays, and his most famous one, Federalist No. 10, is a masterpiece of political theory. In it, he addresses the biggest fear of the time, the danger of factions, or what we might call special interest groups or political parties today. Opponents of the Constitution argued that a large republic could never survive because competing factions would tear it apart. Madison brilliantly turned this argument on its head. He argued that in a large republic, there would be so many different factions and interests that no single one could dominate. They would be forced to compromise and negotiate, protecting the rights of the minority. It's an incredible defense of a pluralistic, diverse society governed by reason. Finally, we have John Jay. Although he wrote only 5 essays, his contributions were crucial. As the nation's first Chief Justice and an experienced diplomat, Jay focused on the Constitution's role in foreign relations in essays like Federalist No. 3 and Non. 4. He argued that a united nation under a single government would be far stronger and more respected on the world stage. It could better negotiate treaties, defend against foreign threats, and prevent conflicts between the states themselves. Unfortunately, Jay fell ill early in the project, which is why his contribution is smaller. But his arguments laid a critical foundation for understanding America's place in the world. So, what exactly were they arguing? The Federalist Papers cover a vast range of topics, but a few key themes stand out. One major theme is the balance of power. The authors meticulously explain the system of checks and balances between the 3 branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. They show how each branch has the power to limit the others, preventing any one part of the government from becoming too tyrannical. For example, the president can veto laws from Congress, but Congress can override the veto. The courts can declare laws unconstitutional, but the president appoints the judges and the Senate confirms them. It was a brilliant system designed to preserve liberty by dividing power. Another key argument was for what is known as federalism, the division of power between the national government and the state governments. The authors explained that the Constitution didn't erase the states. It created a new partnership. The federal government would have specific, enumerated powers, like coining money and regulating interstate commerce, while all other powers would be reserved for the states. This dual system was designed to give the country the strength it needed to act as a single nation, while still preserving local control and individual liberties. They argue that this was the best of both worlds, a compound republic that could govern a vast territory effectively. The Federalist Papers also championed the idea of a representative government, not a direct democracy. The authors believed that having citizens elect representatives to make decisions on their behalf would refine public opinion. These elected officials, they hoped, would be wise, virtuous individuals who could deliberate on complex issues and act for the common good, rather than being swayed by the temporary passions of the crowd. This is why we have an electoral college, and why senators were originally chosen by state legislatures. It was all part of a design to filter public opinion through a layer of deliberation. The impact of these 85 essays was immense. While it's hard to say they single-handedly won the ratification debate, they were undeniably a powerful force. They armed supporters of the Constitution with well-reasoned arguments and systematically dismantled the claims of their opponents. Known as the the essays were reprinted in newspapers across the country, shaping the conversation and providing a clear, compelling vision for America's future. In crucial states like New York and Virginia, where the vote was incredibly close, the Federalist Papers helped tip the scales in favor of ratification. But their influence didn't end in 1788. The Federalist Papers have become one of the most important sources for interpreting the Constitution. For over 2 centuries, lawyers, judges, and scholars have turned to these essays to understand the original intent of the framers. When the Supreme Court is trying to figure out what the Commerce Clause means, or what the framers intended for presidential power, they often cite Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson. The papers provide a window into the minds of the people who designed our government, making them a living document that continues to shape American law and politics today. In essence, the Federalist Papers were more than just a marketing campaign for the Constitution. They were a profound meditation on the nature of government, power, and liberty. They took complex political philosophy and made it accessible to the average citizen. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay weren't just arguing for a new set of rules. They were arguing for a new way of thinking about what a nation could be. They believed that through careful design and a commitment to reason, a government could be created that was both strong enough to be effective and limited enough to protect freedom. So, the next time you hear about checks and balances, the separation of powers, or the dangers of faction, remember Publius. Remember the three men who, in a race against time, laid out a logical, hopeful, and enduring vision for the American Republic. Their words helped build a nation and continue to challenge us to live up to its founding ideals. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Federalist Papers, or if there is another topic you'd like to see covered. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the making of America. Last time, we witnessed the monumental effort to draft the U.S. Constitution, a document designed to create a more perfect union. But as the ink dried in Philadelphia, a new battle was just beginning. The fight wasn't over the structure of government anymore. It was about the very soul of American liberty. This is a story of the demand for a Bill of Rights. Imagine this. You've just thrown off the yoke of a powerful king. You fought a long, bloody war because that government overstepped its bounds, telling you where to worship, what you could say, and searching your homes without cause. Now, a new, powerful central government is being proposed. Would you just trust it? Would you assume it would respect your freedoms without being explicitly told to? Absolutely not. And that was the exact sentiment echoing across the newly formed states. The group that championed this cause became known as the Anti-Federalists. Now, don't let the name fool you. They weren't against a federal system entirely. They were patriots like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Samuel Adams. These were men who had risked everything for independence. Their argument was powerful and simple. The new Constitution was a brilliant framework for a government, but it was dangerously silent on the rights of the people. It detailed what the government could do, but it didn't clearly state what it could not do. George Mason, one of the delegates who refused to sign the Constitution, put it best. He said he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands. Why? Because it had no Declaration of Rights. The Federalists, the proponents of the Constitution like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, initially pushed back. Their argument, laid out in the famous Federalist Papers, was that the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights. They argued that the government was one of enumerated powers, meaning it could only do what was explicitly listed. Since the power to, say, restrict free speech wasn't listed, the government didn't have that power. Listing specific rights, they worried, might be dangerous. What if they forgot one? Would that mean the people didn't have that right? Hamilton wrote in Federalist No. 84 that a Bill of Rights was not only unnecessary, but could even be dangerous. But this argument, however logical, didn't soothe the public's fears. The memory of British tyranny was too fresh. People wanted their rights written down, etched in stone, undeniable. They didn't want their freedoms to depend on a clever interpretation of what the government was allowed to do. They wanted a clear list of what it could never do. The debate raged in the state ratifying conventions. In Massachusetts, a crucial swing state, the convention was deadlocked. The Constitution was on the verge of failure. It was here that a brilliant compromise was struck, known as the Massachusetts Compromise. The delegates agreed to ratify the Constitution, but on one condition: they would strongly recommend that a series of amendments protecting individual rights be added immediately after ratification. This became the motto. State after state ratified the Constitution with the same understanding that a Bill of Rights was forthcoming. The pressure was immense. The new government needed legitimacy, and it could get it if a huge portion of the population felt their fundamental liberties were at risk. North Carolina and Rhode Island even refused to ratify the Constitution at all until they saw a concrete Bill of Rights. The message was clear: no rights, no union. This is where a key figure, James Madison, undergoes a fascinating transformation. Initially, he sided with Hamilton, believing a Bill of Rights was a parchment barrier that could untruly stop a government determined to be tyrannical. But Madison was also a brilliant political strategist and a pragmatist. He saw that the demand for a Bill of Rights wasn't just a fringe opinion. It was a powerful national movement that threatened to tear the new nation apart before it even got started. Opponents were calling for a second constitutional convention to rewrite the whole document, a prospect that terrified Madison and other Federalists. So, when Madison was elected to the very first Congress, he made a promise. He had campaigned on the pledge that he would personally take up the cause of a Bill of Rights. He realized it was the only way to unite the country, to win over the doubters, and to ensure the long-term success of the Constitution he had worked so hard to create. He shifted from being a skeptic to becoming the primary champion and author of the Bill of Rights. Once in Congress, Madison got to work. He sifted through over 200 proposed amendments that had been sent in by the state ratifying conventions. He distilled them down into a concise list that addressed the most pressing fears of the people: freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, and the right to a fair trial, among others. He proposed that these amendments be woven directly into the text of the Constitution. However, Congress decided it would be better to add them as a separate list at the end, which is the form we know today. After being debated and refined by both the House and the Senate, 12 amendments were sent to the states for ratification in September of 1789. It took 2 long years, but on December 15, 1791, with Virginia's ratification, 10 of those 12 amendments became law. These first 10 amendments are what we now call the Bill of Rights. The seed that was planted in the heated debates of the ratifying conventions had finally blossomed, thanks to the persistence of the Anti-Federalists and the pragmatic leadership of James Madison. And so, the Constitution was complete. It was a document that not only established a strong and effective government, but also enshrined the fundamental liberties of its citizens. This dual achievement is what makes it so enduring. It created a system powerful enough to govern, but, crucially, bound by law to respect the rights of the governed. The demand for a Bill of Rights wasn't a sign of the Constitution's weakness. It was the first great test of its strength and its ability to adapt to the will of the people. It was the moment the promise of the Revolution was finally written into the law of the land. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of the most critical chapters in American history. The story of our government is the story of our rights, and understanding how they came to be is essential for protecting them today. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey through the founding of the United States. In our last episode, we left the fate of a nation hanging in the balance. The Constitutional Convention had produced a groundbreaking document, but its future was far from certain. Today, we dive into the dramatic final chapter of its creation. Chapter 18. The Constitution becomes law. Imagine the scene. It's late 1787. The proposed Constitution, a radical blueprint for a new form of government, is sent out to the 13 states. But it wouldn't become law just because a few dozen men in Philadelphia signed it. No, the power now shifted to the people, or at least to their elected representatives in special state conventions. The ratification process was on, and it was a political battlefield unlike any seen before. The magic number was 9. Article 7 of the Constitution stipulated that it would go into effect once 9 of the 13 states had approved it. This was a clever move. It bypassed the old Articles of Confederation, which required unanimous consent, an impossible hurdle. But getting to 9 would be a monumental struggle. 2 opposing factions quickly emerged: the Federalists and the The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, were the champions of the Constitution. They argued that a strong, centralized government was essential for the nation's survival. They believed it would provide stability, protect against foreign threats, and regulate commerce, preventing the economic chaos that had plagued the states under the Articles of Confederation. To make their case to the public, especially in the crucial state of New York, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote a series of 85 essays, published in newspapers under the pseudonym Publius. These essays are known today as the Federalist Papers. They are a masterclass in political philosophy, brilliantly dissecting every clause of the Constitution and explaining its logic and necessity. They argued that the new government wasn't a threat to liberty, but its greatest protector, with a complex system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. On the other side stood the anti-fascists. This wasn't a single, unified party, but a diverse group of passionate individuals who feared the new Constitution. Figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Samuel Adams worried that it created a government that was too powerful, too distant, and too much like the British monarchy. They had just fought a war to escape. Their biggest and most powerful argument was the lack of a Bill of Rights. Where were the explicit protections for individual liberties? Where was the guarantee of free speech, a free press, or the right to a trial by jury? They painted a grim picture of a future where a powerful federal government could trample on the rights of the common citizen. They argued that the president could become a king, and the Senate an out-of-touch aristocracy. Their writings, like the letters from the federal farmer, resonated with many Americans who were deeply suspicious of centralized authority. The debate raged in towns, taverns, and state houses across the country. It was a war of words, pamphlets, and impassioned speeches. Delaware was the first to jump on board, ratifying unanimously in December 1787. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut followed quickly. The Federalists had early momentum, but then came the real test: Massachusetts. The state was deeply divided. The memory of Shays' Rebellion was still fresh, pushing some towards a stronger government, while others feared that very strength. The compromise that broke the deadlock here would become a model for the nation. The Massachusetts Convention agreed to ratify the Constitution, but with a strong recommendation that a Bill of Rights be added as soon as the new government was formed. This was the ratify now, amend later strategy. This compromise proved to be the key. Maryland and South Carolina followed, bringing the total to 8 states. The entire nation held its breath. Which state would be the crucial 9th? The honor fell to New Hampshire. On June 21, 1788, by a close vote of 57 to 47, New Hampshire ratified the Constitution. The threshold was met. Technically, the United States had a new government. The ship of state was officially launched, but the celebration was cautious. 2 of the largest, wealthiest, and most populous states were still holding out: Virginia and New York. Without their participation, the new union would be fractured and weak, a geographical mess. The debate in Virginia was legendary, pitting giants against giants. Patrick Henry, the fiery orator of the Revolution, delivered powerful speeches against ratification, famously declaring he smelt a rat. He was countered by James Madison and a young, brilliant lawyer named John Marshall. In the end, Virginia voted to ratify just 4 days after New Hampshire. But, like Massachusetts, they insisted on the future edition of a Bill of Rights. All eyes then turned to New York. Here, Alexander Hamilton fought a heroic political battle against a strong anti-federalist majority. The news of Virginia's ratification arrived at a critical moment, putting immense pressure on New York not to be left out of the new nation. Finally, on July 26, 1788, New York voted to ratify by an incredibly narrow margin, 30 to 27. The Federalist Papers had done their job. The United States was now truly united under its new Constitution. North Carolina would join in 1789, and stubborn Rhode Island, the last holdout, finally ratified in 1790. With the Constitution ratified, the next task was to bring this new government to life. The old Confederation Congress set the dates for the first national elections. The winter of 1788 to 1789 was a time of great anticipation. Electors were chosen in each state, and when they cast their votes, the result was a foregone conclusion. There was only one man who commanded the universal respect and admiration of the entire nation. One person who could unite the squabbling factions and give the new government the legitimacy it desperately needed. That man, of course, was George Washington. He had led the Continental Army to victory and had presided over the Constitutional Convention. He was the embodiment of civic virtue. In April 1789, the electoral votes were counted. The result was unprecedented in American history and has never been repeated since. George Washington was elected president by a unanimous vote. Every single elector cast one of their votes for him. John Adams, who received the second highest number of votes, became the first vice president. Washington's journey from his home at Mount Vernon to the temporary capital in New York City was a triumphant procession. Towns and cities along the way held parades and celebrations. On April 30th, 1789, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall on Wall Street, George Washington placed his hand on a Bible and took the oath of office. He swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. At that moment, the experiment began. The paper document, born of debate and compromise, was now a living, breathing government, led by a president who had the trust of the people. The ratification of the Constitution and the election of George Washington marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The turbulent, uncertain years following the Revolution were over. The task ahead for Washington and the First Congress was immense. They had to build the machinery of government from scratch, create a financial system, establish a judiciary, and, crucially, deliver on the promise of a Bill of Rights. James Madison, now a member of the new House of Representatives, would take the lead. Drafting the first 10 amendments that would be ratified in 1791, solidifying the liberties that the Anti-Federalists had fought so hard to protect. The great American experiment in self-government was underway, a journey of challenges and triumphs that continues to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a pivotal moment in American history. It's a story of debate, compromise, and ultimately, faith in a new idea of government. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the grand story of America. Today, we're tackling a monumental chapter, one that sits at the very heart of what it means to be an American. The Bill of Rights. If you've been following along, you know that the creation of the Constitution wasn't a smooth ride. It was a fierce debate, a clash of brilliant minds and powerful ideas. One of the biggest sticking points, a major source of anxiety for many of the Founding Fathers, was the fear of a central government that was too powerful. They had just fought a revolution to escape the tyranny of a king. They weren't about to create a new form of oppression right here at home. Think about it. Figures like Patrick Henry, the man who famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," were deeply suspicious of the new Constitution. They looked at this powerful federal framework and asked, where are the guarantees? Where is the protection for the individual citizen against this new government? They weren't alone. This sentiment was widespread, and it threatened to derail the entire ratification process. The Anti-Federalists, as they were known, argued passionately that without a specific list of protected rights, the freedoms they had fought so hard for could be easily eroded. In response, a brilliant compromise was struck. The Federalists, proponents of the new Constitution like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, promised that if the states would ratify the document, the very first order of business for the new Congress would be to draft a series of amendments protecting individual liberties. This was more than just a political maneuver. It was a promise, a solemn pact with the American people. And in 1789, they made good on that promise. James Madison, once skeptical of the need for a Bill of Rights, took the lead. He sifted through over 200 proposed amendments submitted by the various states. He wasn't just collecting ideas. He was distilling the very essence of liberty. He was trying to codify the fundamental human rights that the Revolution had been fought to secure. It was a massive undertaking, sorting through demands, refining language, and ensuring each proposed right was clear, concise, and powerful. After intense debate and refinement in Congress, 12 amendments were sent to the states for ratification. It is fascinating to note that the first two proposed amendments didn't actually make the cut at the time. One dealt with the apportionment of representatives, and the other with congressional pay raises. The latter would eventually be ratified over 200 years later as the 27th Amendment, but it was the remaining 10 that captured the nation's heart and soul. By December 15, 1791, enough states had ratified these 10 amendments, and they officially became part of the Constitution. This was the moment the promise was fulfilled. The Bill of Rights was born. So, what exactly is in this Bill of Rights? Let's break it down, because these aren't just historical footnotes. They are living, breathing principles that shape our lives every single day. First up, the First Amendment. This is the big one, the one most people can name. It's a powerhouse of personal freedom. It guarantees freedom of religion, meaning the government can't establish an official church or stop you from practicing your faith. It guarantees freedom of speech, the right to express your opinions, even if they are unpopular. It protects the freedom of the press, allowing journalists and citizens to report on the government without fear of censorship, and it secures the right to assemble peacefully and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. These 5 freedoms are the bedrock of an open, democratic society. They ensure that the power of ideas, not the power of the state, rules the day. Next, we have the Second Amendment, which protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. This is, without a doubt, one of the most debated amendments. Its historical context is tied to the idea of a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, a concept born from the colonists' experience relying on citizen soldiers during the Revolution. The interpretation and application of this amendment continued to be a major topic of discussion in American society today. The Third Amendment might seem a bit odd to us now, but it was a huge deal back then. It prevents the government from forcing homeowners to quarter soldiers in their homes without their consent. This was a direct response to the hated quartering acts imposed by the British before the Revolution. It is a powerful statement about the sanctity of the home and the right to privacy from government intrusion. Now, let's move into the rights of the accused. This is where the Bill of Rights draws a clear line in the sand, protecting citizens from the potential overreach of the justice system. The Fourth Amendment is your protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. This means law enforcement can't just barge into your home or search your belongings without a warrant. And to get a warrant, they must have probable cause. This is another cornerstone of our right to privacy. The Fifth Amendment is packed with protections. It guarantees the right to a grand jury for serious crimes, protects against double jeopardy, being tried for the same crime twice, and famously protects against self-incrimination. This is your right to remain silent. It also includes the Due Process Clause, ensuring the government must follow fair procedures, and the Takings Clause, which requires the government to provide just compensation if it takes private property for public use. The Sixth Amendment focuses on the trial itself. It guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. It ensures you have the right to be informed of the charges against you, to confront witnesses who are testifying against you, and crucially, the right to an attorney to assist in your defense. The Seventh Amendment guarantees the right to a jury trial in certain civil cases, extending the jury system beyond just criminal matters. And the Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and fines, as well as cruel and unusual punishments. This amendment forces us to constantly reevaluate what constitutes humane and just punishment in a civilized society. We're almost there. The final 2 amendments are a bit different. They address the scope of rights and governmental power. The Ninth Amendment is a brilliant piece of legal foresight. It states that the enumeration of specific rights in the Constitution does not mean that these are the only rights people have. It's a catch-all, acknowledging that our liberties are vast and cannot be fully listed in a single document. It affirms that you have other fundamental rights, even if they aren't explicitly written down. Finally, the 10th Amendment reinforces the principle of federalism. It states that any powers not specifically given to the federal government, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved for the states or the people. This was a direct nod to the anti-federalists' concerns, a final assurance that the federal government's power has clear limits and that states and citizens retain a significant degree of autonomy. Together, these 10 amendments form a powerful shield. They protect the individual from the state. They ensure that the government serves the people, not the other way around. The Bill of Rights transformed the Constitution from a blueprint for government into a charter of human liberty. It was the fulfillment of a promise, and its legacy is a nation built on the foundation of freedom, justice, and the undeniable rights of the individual. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most important documents in American history. It's a story that continues to unfold, and its principles are as relevant today as they were in 1791. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up, and do forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into something truly remarkable, the enduring legacy of 1787, and the document born from that pivotal year, the United States Constitution. Have you ever stopped to think about how a piece of parchment, written over 230 years ago, continues to shape our lives every single day? It's a story of foresight, compromise, and an extraordinary vision for the future. Let's rewind to that sweltering summer in Philadelphia. The year is 1787. A group of delegates, men of their time with all their complexities and contradictions, gathered with a monumental task to forge a new government. The Articles of Confederation had proven too weak, and the young nation was teetering on the brink of collapse. What they created was not just a set of rules, but a framework for a nation built on the radical idea of we the people. This phrase, the very opening of the Constitution, was revolutionary. It declared that the power of the government didn't come from a king or a distant parliament, but from the citizens themselves. This concept of popular sovereignty became the bedrock of American democracy. The framers designed a system of checks and balances, three distinct branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. No single branch could become all. Congress makes the laws, the president enforces them, and the Supreme Court interprets them. This elegant dance of power, this intentional tension, was designed to prevent tyranny and protect individual liberties. But here's the real genius of the Constitution. It was designed to be a living document. The framers knew they couldn't possibly predict the challenges of the future. They couldn't have imagined the internet, space travel, or the complex social issues we face today. So, they included a mechanism for change. The amendment process, think about it. The original document didn't even include the Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments, guaranteeing freedoms like speech, religion, and the press, were added shortly after ratification to address fears of an overreaching federal government. This ability to adapt is precisely why the Constitution has endured. It's the longest surviving written charter of government in the world today. Over the centuries, it has been amended 27 times. These amendments reflect the nation's ongoing struggle and progress. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 19th granted women the right to vote. The 26th lowered the voting age to 18, a direct response to the young soldiers fighting in Vietnam. Each amendment is a chapter in the evolving story of American freedom and the ongoing effort to create a more perfect union. Of course, the journey hasn't been a straight line. The Constitution's legacy is complex and often contested. The original text contained compromises that protected the institution of slavery, a deep moral failing that led to the Civil War. The interpretation of its clauses has been the subject of fierce debate throughout our history, from the scope of federal power to the meaning of individual rights. Landmark Supreme Court cases like Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review, and Brown v. Board of Education, which declared segregation unconstitutional, have profoundly reshaped the nation by reinterpreting the Constitution's words. These debates continue today. When we argue about privacy in the digital age, campaign finance, or the limits of executive power, we are participating in the very same process the framers envisioned. We are wrestling with how to apply timeless principles to modern problems. This ongoing conversation is not a sign of the Constitution's weakness, but of its strength. It forces each generation to engage with its core values and define what it means to be an American. The legacy of 1787 is not just a historical artifact confined to a museum. It's a dynamic force in our daily lives. It's the reason you can voice your opinion, worship as you choose, and vote for your leaders. It provides the framework for our legal system and the structure of our government. It is a testament to the idea that a government can be founded on principles of liberty and consent, and that it can be designed to evolve with the people it serves. The document is a promise of liberty, equality, and justice. It's a promise that has not always been kept for all people, and the work to fully realize that promise is far from over. But the framework it provides gives us the tools to continue that work. The legacy of 1787 is not just what was written down on paper. It's the continuing, multi-generational project of building a nation. It's a call to action for every citizen to participate, to debate, and to strive for that more perfect union. So, the next time you hear a debate about the Constitution, Remember its incredible journey from a hot room in Philadelphia to the digital age. It has remained the central pillar of American democracy. It is a symbol of both our highest ideals and our deepest struggles, a living testament to the enduring power of an idea. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the legacy of 1787. I hope it has given you a new appreciation for this foundational document. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration into history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.